Here on behalf of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame to moderate this discussion by three writers. And I think we have a real event in store for us. Two major American poets, one major American historian, all three fine writers. And I look forward to hearing from them. I'd remind you that tomorrow's induction ceremony for these people into the Hall of Fame will be at 10 o'clock in this room. So I hope you'll all be here. And in addition to our panelists today, Eugenia Price will be inducted posthumously. And I also have been asked by an individual who will go unnamed to point out that in 2012, an entire issue of the Georgia Review was devoted to the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, and it's for sale out in the hall. It's a really great issue. And I'd like to thank Leandra Nessel and Toby Graham and Skip Hewlett for all they do to organize events like this, sponsor the Hall of Fame. They do a great job, and it's a real service to the university and to the writing community and to the state. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to these writers. You'll hear more about them tomorrow, and I believe there's very detailed introductions on the website that are really worth reading. So first of all, we have James Cobb, who's a leading historian of the American South. He's that rare example of an accomplished scholar with a large following of everyday readers, as well as, of course, we hope, other scholars. He joined the UGA faculty in 1989. He's a Spalding Distinguished Professor of the American South, and he retired from that position last year. He's the author of 12 books, among them, I'll list three titles, all of them highly regarded: Georgia Odyssey, A Way Down South, A History of Southern Identity, and The South in America Since World War II. He still lectures and writes and maintains a very interesting blog, and I believe he's taken up race car driving. Alfred Corn is a poet, novelist, and essay, born in Bainbridge, Georgia. He now resides in Rhode Island, but he's lived in many different parts of the world. He has published 12 books of poetry, 2 novels, a book of prosody, 2 collections of literary criticism, a study of British and American English, art criticism, and translations of numerous writers. His work has appeared in an array of newspapers and journals and magazines for literally half a century. He taught creative writing at Columbia University for 18 years and has held a number of different visiting positions. His most recent poetry collection, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me, is entitled Tables. And finally, Kevin Young, who is a well-known poet and writer who currently directs the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and is the poetry editor for The New Yorker. He was born in Lincoln, Nebraska. He lives now in New York. He spent 15 years or so in Georgia writing and teaching creative writing at the University of Georgia, that's this school, and at Emory University. He has written 8 books of poetry and 2 works of nonfiction. His poems and essays and reviews have been widely printed. His new and timely book is entitled Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News. So I'd like to encourage everybody to ask questions along the way. We'll try to have some time at the end for questions and discussion. But I'd like to sort of get things started by asking the people here today to talk about how and whether they feel that they are a Georgia writer and exactly what that label does or does not mean to them. So, who would like to begin?
He has a big old pad over there. History proceed.
Well, I guess it's logical since I'm obviously a Georgia writer, there's in 1938, nobody could figure out exactly how it was when Franklin Roosevelt, who was so immensely popular in Georgia, nominated someone to unseat Walter F. George in the U.S. Senate. As Roosevelt's popularity never wavered in Georgia, but he was resoundingly rebuffed at the polls, and George was reelected. And they asked an old gent down in South Georgia how he would explain it, and he said, "Well, we Georgians are just Georgian as hell." And I guess if there's anybody who's Georgian as hell, I am he or she. That's not that's not quite the. I don't mean that to have the kind of flag waving connotation that it might seem to have, because I kind of agree with Faulkner, which is always a pretty safe position. That when it comes to places, well, I think probably when it comes to practically anything, we love as much despite as because. And so I don't view being a Georgia writer as indicating that, I can't write critically about what happens and what I've seen happen in this state. But I do think it, being a native Georgian has given me some distinct advantages in terms of sort of an anchor and perspective. And of course, when I came along, I was fortunate in the enriching sense to come along to grow up in the 1950s and early 1960s and still be kind of around when the state was really, really in a transition from agriculture to industry, and the Jim Crow system was under attack, but it was still intact. During my upbringing, mine was the last graduating class at Hart County High School, segregated class. So, Georgia and the Georgia I experienced growing up, and then the Georgia I went on to study, I think did me a world of good, just in terms of presenting me with a lot of the themes that I would try to explore on a larger, more universal basis later on. And, insofar as the title Georgia writer might imply, I'm not implying any comparison whatsoever, except that to say, if it implies, well, he's only, George is all he knows and all he cares about and all he could write about. William Faulkner was a Mississippi writer too, so I'm not so worried about that. In fact, I think Georgia has in many ways been kind of a big part of my window on the world. It might have been smudged here and there, but it opened me up to a lot of things that really helped me as a Southern historian and writer, and yet I still, would say, sort of, kept me grounded.
Thanks so much for having me, and it's particularly nice to be here with Hugh, who hired me, actually. You may not remember, but I remember sitting in the office and him writing on a pad, and suddenly I was teaching here at University of Georgia. So it's really an honor to be back here. I actually have been in Georgia teaching and just moved in August, so it's strange to say that I'm not living here, but between Emory and University of Georgia, I taught and lived in Georgia 17 years, which is the longest I lived anywhere. I moved around a lot as a kid, and even Kansas, where I had gone to high school, wasn't a place that I lived as long. So in many ways, just in terms of time, Georgia has been a home to me. But I think there's another kind of way of thinking of home. Both my parents are from Louisiana, and we grew up traveling around, and it makes it sound like we're gypsies or something, but itinerant musicians, but we weren't. My father and mother were both sort of the first to leave home, the first to journey beyond Louisiana, really. And I think that migratory quality seemed to me essentially Southern, especially when I started writing poems about them. And it really wasn't until I came to Georgia, right when my first book had come out, that I started thinking about home in a different way. My first book was called Most Way Home, and was very much thinking about home as a place you weren't. And how did that jive with the African American experience? And I think very much it did. Georgia provided me, as you said, I think, a vantage point, but also sort of examples of terrific writers. When I think of a Georgia writer, I think of a writer like Jean Toomer, which we sort of talked about in some of our backs and forths. And I think Toomer, of course, was here very briefly, but very much a writer steeped in the landscape. And I think that really gets into your blood pretty quickly, the look and the feel of the place. I know if I hadn't returned to the South and it felt like a return, we ate Southern food, what my father used to say, people call it soul food, we used to just call it food. But I didn't thought everyone ate okra for every single meal. And we grew our own food often, and my father hunted. It was very much a sort of way of life that I realize now, as I was writing about it even, was disappearing. And I don't think if I hadn't moved back here, I would have gone on to write some of my other books that embraced the blues. Certainly, when I first moved here to Athens, the train was my friend, was one of my few friends, and its lonely whistle sort of kept me company many nights, and I ended up writing a book called Jelly Roll of Blues that was very much steeped in, if not the landscape, then somewhat the language of this place. I know I wouldn't have turned and written a book like For the Confederate Dead, whose title I worried about, and phoned up my editor and said, can I publish a book called this? What will happen? And I'm really glad I did, because it taught me a lot about friendship, about the other original meaning of Confederate as an ally. And it's nice to be back here with some allies in this room, and I think that's my best first take on that notion.
Yeah, when I think about that question, a very deep and strong feeling comes over me. I spent the first 22 years of my life here. I spent more years out of the state than in it, but first impressions are strong. And so many different things. I mean, you take my mother tongue. I learned Southern American English, Georgian English right here. And actually I learned two forms of it, because we were constantly surrounded by black people who spoke a variety of English. And I became aware very early that there are different languages, there are different codes to how we express and perceive the world. My graduate degree was in French Lit, so I think I'm very good at languages, because at a very early age I saw that there are different ways of speaking. And if you don't focus on speech, you really can't be a writer, can you? So I learned my language here. I learned my religion here. And there was constant Bible reading, and so there was an input of 17th century English diction that became part of my consciousness. And later on, as I began to, study English literature, I realized that one of the keys to English literature is the King James Version of the Bible. So those are powerful early things. The nature, our house was out at the edge of the city limits, and I took long walks and absorbed the natural surroundings. The area had beautiful lakes in it. And whenever I return, which is not so often, but when I do return, all those feelings from childhood come. The live oak trees streaming with the Spanish moss, certain bird calls, the mockingbird, whippoorwill, certain scents like honeysuckle. And it has a powerful effect on me. It sometimes has resulted in things that I've written. I'm sort of, what's in front of me is what I write about. So, because I've lived so many years elsewhere in northern states and also in Europe, a lot of it is about that. But occasionally, something will jog loose a memory or something, and I'll write about those early years. So I do think that it has had an effect on me as a writer. I mean, when you're interviewed, it's a little bit like being the graduate student to yourself, and I may not be the best judge of it. Somebody else would have to tell me in ways in which it's apparent to them, where I come from. But those are some of the things. Oh, well, and one other thing, I'd say that Southerners in general, and Georgians in particular, have a sense of humor, sometimes anarchic, crazy, and I have that. I like a good joke. That sort of creeps into your sensibility, I think. Shakespeare has a line, he talks about that one touch of nature that makes the whole world kin. And Southerners tend to have that. We seem to be able to talk to just about anybody. There's that sense of connection that we have. And for me, that's sort of part of my toolbox as a writer, to intuit what other people are like and to understand them and to be able to speak to them. So I would mention that as well.
Thank you. Would y'all talk a bit about how you can, it could take you 45 minutes. I'm talking about the 1 or 2 minute version. How you came to be a writer. How did you discover that this was what you wanted to do?
I think in your office, I discovered.
I don't believe that.
I think that for me, I took a class in a summer program, and that looking back on it and moving, I went through a lot of boxes and see the ways that before then I wrote little things, but it was really then that made me start thinking about poetry as an idea. But I think I was really shaped later by reading the work of people like Rita Dove, who was someone who thought about history and how it was personal. And I think that that's another aspect to me, at least, of being a Southern writer or someone who writes from Georgia, or any aspect of it you want to think about, because I think history becomes very present and very much something that both is contemplated and also contended with. The past isn't even past. It's more Faulkner for you. So I guess for me, that aspect of sort of understanding the connection between my life as it was when I was pretty young, and my parents' lives, and more importantly, my ancestors, both real and imagined, was really important to me and how I sort of went on my way.
You?
Well, I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow, but I grew up, my mother was a voracious reader, and I was the only child that lived out in the country in the summers before I got big enough to work on the farm. But it was my ambition to tear through every book offered in the library's summer reading program. And I just sort of developed this thing about, how great it would be to be able to kind of craft sentences that could affect people or inform people. And, we're talking about a sixth grader here. I mean, I'm not going to give you anything more sophisticated than that, but I did. I mean, and I was very fortunate, as were others in this room, to attend a high school where writing was not just encouraged but required, as was a great deal of reading, and also as was a complete immersion in texts of examples of what were then seen as great writing, and so and of course my chosen profession more or less required that I do some writing. I wrote a master's thesis, wrote a dissertation, but I realized by the time I was doing that that this is something I would want to do even if I didn't have to do it. So it just became part of my nature to do it. I wrote a lot in high school, and it was extremely satisfying. It was really really hard. I never I always kind of cringe when somebody says and seldom about me. Well, such a gifted writer, which sort of, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a gifted writer. I mean, there are lots of them, or some, but to me that's not the story of writing for me. I mean, the story of writing for me is like Hawthorne said, good reading is damn hard writing, and to me it's just like an old bare knuckle, nose biting, eye gouging fight with a bunch of words to make them say, by God, what you want them to say. And my wife will tell you that's why I wind up staring at the computer screen for so many hours a day and come down and seem to have accomplished no more than I had under my belt when I left breakfast. So, but it just became kind of just sort of all-encompassing kind of urge to write, and I was very, very fortunate to pick a few good topics and say a couple of decent things here and there about them, so that I was able to kind of make my living in part by doing something that I would have done for free if beer had been free. Oh, I want to say though, before I stop this, Kevin, I'd forgotten he's from Louisiana. If you read one of the things I love about reading his poetry is his description of food, in many aspects, in many contexts, and in relationship to critical people as well. But I was just thinking in terms of Lincoln, Nebraska, and I was thinking, nobody, none of that food he's writing about is anything I recall from my time in the Midwest particularly, but his Louisiana roots come through, and it's one of those cases where when you read his verse, you come away hungry in more ways. You're hungry for more of his writing, but you come away hungry, period. At least that.
Well, it was a long process. I don't know exactly when I, said, well, I'm going to be a writer, but I was writing early on. I remember in 8th grade, Marcia, what was her last name, was writing a little poem on her desk, and I looked over and I said, oh, you wrote that? And she said, yes. I said, oh, well, I want to write one. So I started writing little poems. I read a lot as a kid. It was my great escape. My sisters, they'll tell you, I just would go off and just read for hours and hours and hours. So reading, it's sort of, you want to imitate it. You say, oh, that's wonderful, I want to do something like that. So I started writing short stories around age 12, 13, poems. I was a constant visitor to the Carnegie Library, the local library. And I came across an anthology of 20th century American poetry by Louis Untermeyer. And I read that, and it was different from the poems I knew because it was modernism, and I began to imitate that. So a lot of it was just imitation. I don't know that I thought I would, think of it as a profession. It was just something I enjoyed doing. And then when I went to college, and a student at Emory, I met a few aspiring writers, and we used to read our stuff to each other. Some of them had met real-life poets like James Dickey, and I began to be acquainted with poetry that's being written right now, well, back then, by living poets. And actually, as an undergrad, I think was more focused on fiction. Wrote more short stories than poems. I remember we had a course in modernist poetry, and T.S. Eliot was sort of God then, and I didn't really like poetry that much. And so I thought, well, if that's what poetry should be, maybe I don't know, but I really want to write that. So I just focused on fiction for that. So when I went to New York to grad school, I sort of shifted back to poetry, and I'm not sure why. I met Richard Howard, a contemporary poet, now in his 80s, and he was admonishing, but also encouraging, and started showing him my things, and eventually he actually published some of them. So I couldn't get anywhere with fiction. I completed several not very good novels, and I couldn't get them published, so I just sort of shifted to poetry. And I didn't get back to writing novels until the 80s, but finally I had published 2 of them, so I published 2 novels and 12 books of poetry, so I guess I'm kind of a cross between the 2.
I'm curious as to who you're thinking about when you write, whatever it is you're writing. Are you thinking about us? Are you thinking about some other kind of audience? Yourself? Now it's time for an answer.
I have one, but I don't want to go. For me, I guess, I think I'm writing about, or 2 or 4, sort of a older me sometimes. Sometimes I'm writing in the hearing of sort of my grandmother. Sometimes I'm writing as her, But I think understanding a kind of ancestral voice is important to me. Again, it might be imagined as much as a real one. But I think that was important. And then, when my father died and I started writing poems about him, I was sort of writing to him in a way, even though he was gone. And so there's some version of a ghost story always, I think. And trying to kind of get that down is as important, whether you're keeping the ghosts at bay or bringing them close. That seems to me part of the process. But audience is a tricky business if you start thinking too much about it, I think, because you can end up tricking yourself, and thinking, oh, I'm writing this for the people, and really, you're not. Or the books I thought that were really deeply personal, people took as very public, and the books I thought of as super public, people took as very personal. So I actually like that, because after a certain point, it doesn't matter what you meant, and people have their own version of your book, with a few exceptions. But that kind of one hopes for that being seen in that way or being heard. But there's always this echo of either an old me, or, a young me discovering it, or an elder there too.
Jim, who are you writing for?
Well, probably a measure of how I see myself, and unfortunately, probably how I should be seen. The greatest compliment I think I ever got as a writer came from John Shelton Reed, who presented me with a little award at a meeting where Kevin was also recognized a couple of years ago, and the little scroll on the certificate says, he can put the slop down where the hogs can get to it. And so I'm not writing, that's not to say I think I'm writing for hogs, although it would be a whole lot easier most of the time. But it's, I just sort of think, I mean, I've always stressed to my students that, you can't, if you really want to amount to anything in your profession, yes, you can write journal articles, and, you can use all your shorthand and jargon of your discipline, and, you get nods and, affirmation here and there from your 200 or 300 colleagues, but in your discipline across the country. But if you really want to, make a difference, and if you also want to gain a position where your writing can make a much greater difference, you've got to be able to write for an educated, interested public audience. And I think that I try to think of that as sort of it's sort of the target that I'm reaching out for, and that's another way I make my life much more miserable than it need be, by struggling to do that, because it's much easier just to pick up a latest historical monograph and sift through and find the right buzzwords that mean something to historians, but probably not to many other people, and write like that. But if you can take that and actually make it accessible without compromising the integrity of the issues, then I think you've accomplished infinitely more as a writer, as an academic trying to write, is what I'm saying. So I guess that's usually what I'm thinking about when I'm writing.
Alfred?
Yeah, to recap what I said before, in high school I was writing all these things, stories and poems, but I didn't show them to anybody, so I was just writing for myself. And it's a good thing, because nobody else would have liked them. Later on in college, I had met some other aspiring writers, and so we used to read stuff to each other, and that was helpful. Because then, people could point out, well, I'm not sure about that part, and you could say, oh, you could think about it more critically, which I didn't think about it critically before then. And then, you keep reading, and you sort of absorb the values, literary values, and ethical values of the writers you read, even though they may not be still on the planet. So I sort of think it's, when I write, it's like, it's for me, but since I do want to publish, it's got to be for other people too. So I have this internal, group of people, some living, some no longer living. They include people like Shakespeare, I might as well go ahead and say it. And you say, you want to write something that they would like, because they have become a part of you. And you never know if you succeeded, but that's the goal. And it's like to please this internal theater of people who you feel are really present when you're writing. And it's quite a large group. I think if you write for just one or two people, there's something limited about that. But if you write to please all the great dead and some of the living, then that's such a wide range of taste and value and approach that it will come out not as any single one of them, but it will come out as you.
We're going through, most of us would agree, I think, tough times in our country. And I'm wondering, in your role as writers, how these times and their challenges change how you think of yourself as a writer, if they do at all. Or maybe another way to ask is do you feel, in light of these challenges we're facing, that you have some obligation to answer them?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, since I spent part of the morning responding to a request from a friend to try to refute this idiotic letter written about still trying to push the idea that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. You have to think if if we're not going to do it, who is? And and I think rather than I don't think that, for me, the appropriate response to that is not the kind of writing that kind of verges on the limit, but the kind of writing that really I've always thought that good writing, like good teaching, really is not about serving up answers, but raising questions. And I think if you can sort of engage readers to with questions and sort of encourage them, just say, okay, here are the many aspects of this point. It's just not this simple. It's not like yes, all immigration is bad, or all immigration is good. It's this, and this that you have to take into account. I mean, I just think if we had more readers, who were, good questioning readers, who were used to encountering questions and sort of asked a question. The real thing is to get people to question what they read and hear, not just immediately, reach for whatever refutation club they've got to pound it to death. And so that's the way I try to approach it. But I would share one of my kind of ambitions. I don't know why, was always to write something for the Financial Times. And so back during the I suffered what I call sudden onset relevance during the whole Charlottesville mess, and so they asked me to write a brief little op-ed for them, and I did. And when you write for public audiences and these kind of platforms, that's why a lot of academics want to do it, because they're fine with being kind of berated by a colleague who, at worst, can sort of slam you with his horn-rimmed glasses. But just to take the full fury of the public readership is these are two questions. Okay, and this was an op-ed about the history of Confederate monuments and what's at stake and all this. So one of them says one of like 200 more than 200 comments on the piece. One of them said, "Don't know if the author ever lived in the American South, but I expect not." But my favorite was, apparently this guy actually wrote a book about the South. Imagine the poor sods who end up reading it. So it's not for the faint-hearted to do. But I just think if we don't do the will.
I wrote a book called Bunk about this sort of moment in time, though I hadn't quite known it would be such a moment in time. But one of the things I was thinking about when I was writing it, when I started about 6 years ago, was just, are we in a worse moment for hoaxes and lying and fakery? And that seemed to me yes. But also, was it also not just that there was more hoaxes now, but also that the hoaxes themselves were worse. And both seem to me true. And I think if I hadn't spent those years not just, thinking that was true, but writing about how true it was and tracing it from the beginning pretty much of this country and thinking about how Barnum's hoaxing in the 19th century was a way of, proving our bona fides as a nation and understanding, say, a connection to George Washington, or then later Lincoln being lied about, in love letters supposedly that he wrote that turned out was like the psychic mom had told the daughter. Things like that became sort of really present for me, and I tried to really understand how that worked today. This is a roundabout way of saying that I think even something seemingly far from what is happening can quickly, as you say, become onset relevance. And so it almost means to me that as a writer, you have to go and find your thing and write it, because if you had said, a few years from now, fake news will be a buzzword that will be in the subtitle of your book, I'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about, But so I think finding that space of truth and history and understanding. And for me, it was very hard to write a book. I had written already a nonfiction book that was 450 pages, and I thought, well, I'm glad I won't do that again. And then I wrote a 550-page book. I think, but there wasn't any other way to understand it. And I think what helps, and I think about this a lot as a director of a library, is context. Being here in special collections, one of the great things that I think special collections provide us is context and a way of understanding what's happening now, both as an unusual thing, but also as a long-standing thing that has other precedents and antecedents. And I think that's, if anything, as much what we're missing now is this sense of, history and sense of who we are and how we got here. Instead, it's like every day, it's a little like Twitter. You wake up and hold your breath and look, and there's something new and horrible. And I think that's a strange feeling and a very contemporary one. And it leads to some of what you're talking about.
Alfred?
Yeah, when I was growing up, I don't know that I paid a lot of attention to politics. There wasn't a lot of information available at the local newspaper, even occasional newscast on TV. The only thing I remember was that Russia was bad. Other than that, it's still true. Other than that, I don't think I really focused on politics, and it took, the awakening of the Black Civil Rights Movement to sort of shock me awake and say, wait a minute, there's a lot wrong in this world. So as an undergraduate at Emory, I got involved in civil rights demonstrations, and that was the start of it. And then when I went on to New York, it was just at the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, and I became very activist against the Vietnam War, with parades, demonstrations, letters, blah, blah, blah. And so ever since then, I've really been pretty intently focused on political questions. And I was involved in the anti-nuclear things that were particularly strong in the 80s. I've participated in the question of the future of Palestine, on and on and on. And then more recently, of course, we've had this disaster occur to us nationally in the election. Written some limericks that I call Trump rigs. And actually I found that social media are a way to become active. And you say, well, that's just, it's not really writing, but I actually do sometimes spend time researching what I post on Facebook and trying to phrase it well so that people understand it. And I do think that that is a way of shaping opinion. And if you do your homework, and if you can write clearly. And actually some of it I think should be saved, and I have saved some of it for possible essays or whatever. So yes, I do think that a writer can, and in my case must, address issues that we face.
I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions, or writers to ask each other questions. Are there any questions from the audience?
In the middle there.
Yes.
I just wonder, with the different perspectives of the people we have on the panel today, when they started writing, and I'm sure they all wrote with pen or pencil, when the advent of the computer came about, was it hard for them to leave the paper and pencil and go to the computer, or was it just easiest time?
I can testify to that. Of course, I started with pencil and pen. Then I tried to learn to type. I mean, there's an intermediate step you looked at, and that was the manual typewriter. I could not learn to do it. I tried, I couldn't do it. So I always just hunt and peck. Well, it was torture because, in high school and college, you have to turn in these papers, and I would almost get to the bottom without a mistake, and then there would be a mistake, and I have to retype it. So that went on and on. I never became a good typist. And so when the computer, well, it actually began with the word processor came in, I jumped on it because you can finally produce, without too much trouble, a clear text. And then people say, oh, do you write on a computer? And the implication is, oh, you are a computer. I say, no, I write in my mind and I record what I write on the computer. So that's what I do.
I started writing by hand in notebooks. I still do that. I find it not as true for prose, but for poetry, absolutely. I like that connection of my mind and my hand. It's just far enough and just close enough a distance. But I do, after that, put it on the computer, but it comes, I think, from writing long enough ago that I would type it up on a piece of paper and then write all over it. So I essentially do that with poems now. I'll type them up and print them out and scrawl all over them and re-input them. I like that process too because you can see your changes as opposed to the invisibility of word processing on a computer or what have you. And then I generally will carry those around, and it might be years that they sit in that kind of limbo state or what have you. But that I feel like something happens. It's like yeast in the dark or something. There's this leavening that's happening while I'm away from them, and sometimes you go back and you can see. This happens often when you lose a draft or something like that, and then you'll make the same changes without knowing it, and you find the earlier draft. So it's sort of in there, and I think what you said is right. I just find that the poem I have in my head it's always really good, And when you sit down, you're like, why am I mistranslating the really good? And I think when you start out, that really frustrates you. And then I actually come to like that process that happens on a page that is a bit more accidental and a little out of your control.
Well, writing pads were barely invented when I started writing. So I was very fortunate and indulged by a wonderful woman who agreed to be my wife, who also could type 90 words a minute and edit like crazy. And so she was an enabler for me in the sense of I got by with barely being able to type at all, and I kept resisting trying to do anything because I grew to hate email because I had to type just something to somebody. So I finally, after all these many years and after they're working on it a long time, and I don't care what they tell you, I rely a lot more on voice activated software, and they finally got it where it's usable for me. But if any Southerner wants to find regional bias, you go to get one of those pieces of software.
That's not what I thought you were going to say.
I guarantee you, it will make you feel inferior by the words it puts in there, and it will not take a correction from a Southerner. I will tell you that, it will not. But I still, to be honest with you, I can finally edit my own stuff on a computer. But it's been going on for years, but I still can't edit. I mean, I can edit something I'm writing, preparing to send in, but when I get copy editing back that's been done electronically, I can't do it. I just print it out, mark it up, retype it, and send it back. There's still some things I just can't do, and I can't really read dissertations and theses effectively on a computer either. So I doubt that I'll live long enough to overcome that.
And part of it, isn't it the interaction one has with the page? I mean, I feel like you can make a suggestion to yourself that it's harder to do online. Or,
it is.
I find it really important. My publisher still sends copy edits by hand.
God.
And so.
I wish you'd con him into publishing something out.
And it's true for prose and, and it's a lifesaver. I still enjoy it.
Yeah, that's the way I feel.
We have time for one more question.
How did y'all find your editors or people who wanted to publish?
Well, for me, I had a friend who's sort of a mentor, a man named David Calstone, who taught at Rutgers, and he had, before that, taught at Harvard. One of his students, a woman named Elizabeth Sifton, had gone on to be an editor at Viking Publishers. And David finally concluded that I should try to publish a book. So he put me in touch with her. She took it, and it was just that simple. And I know that I was really lucky because it's not usually that easy. So that's how I found my first editor. She did 4 or 5 books, and then I went into other editors.
Did she do prose too?
She did. I submitted a novel to her, but she turned that down. It's a different thing. So.
Yeah. I had poetry is unusual in that many first books, at least now, it's a prize that you win, and so I actually ran into, I think literally last night, my first editor ever, because I sent my book to the National Poetry Series, and Lucille Clifton picked it, and I was pretty, it was pretty much my undergraduate thesis. So I took out a poem, I think, and wrote a couple more, and it became a book. After it got taken, there was an editor, they told me, who was my editor, and I called her periodically, and I said, hi, and she would never answer the phone, and there were several different assistants I would talk to. They're like, Mary's not here anymore, and then, so it was getting, November, December, this was over the summer that I won. And in January, she picked up, clearly Mary or whomever had left too, but there was no one but her to pick up the phone, and she said, well, as you know, William Morrow's being sold. I said, I don't know that. I was 21, and she, or 22, and she said, and I don't know what's going to happen, and suddenly I didn't have an editor or a book. And I luckily called a couple people, and they said, well, you could probably take your National Poetry Series win somewhere else. And I thought, oh my God, I won this weird albatross thing. And 2 weeks later, someone else called me up and said, William Morrow's not going to be sold, and your new editor is this guy named Will, and Will was at this party I was at last night. So that was my first, he became head of William Morrow, in fact. But the longer story, like Knopf is who became my first poetry publisher, and that is another longer story, but I've been with her for, I don't know, something like 8 books now, Deb Garrison, and then prose I work with different editors at Grey Wolf. But both cases were prizes that I won that I started working with people.
Well, your question highlights what's already obvious, I'm sure, is that these guys operate in a very different and higher league than I do. I've never really had a single person edit more than one of my books. When I started out, my first book, I was looking for the best academic press I could to publish it, because that's how you start establishing your creds to get tenure. So I chose Louisiana State University Press, which was at that point probably the leading traditional academic press dealing in Southern history mainly. But by the time I moved on to the second book, because I was by then really trying to reach out to a broader audience, I approached Oxford University Press, which is billed as the largest university press in the world, but it does have it did have a substantial trade division that publishes books that cross over into popular reading as well as academic reading. But by the time I got there, the turnover in the publishing business had gotten to the point, as Kevin was sort of describing, you never knew who was going to own what press at a certain time or who was going to be around. And so the people I worked with at Oxford. And some of the people, like the design people, and they were still around. But I never had the same author at Oxford for any of my 3 books with them. And I don't have an agent. People ask me, well, who's your agent? Well, I only half jokingly reply, well, I figure I couldn't even get the county agent to return my calls, let alone some agent in New York. But I just have never, I've never just made that leap to give that a try. But I do think, in trying really to give you some answer to your actual question, I do think you find publishers with whom written broadly, just the way they do things, and maybe it's because you develop a certain familiarity with how they do things and you're comfortable with it, that you gravitate toward. You can still do that, even if you can't count on the person who was your editor when you signed the contract for the book still being there when you finish the book.
I'd like to thank our writers. We've had a great discussion. Thank you for being here. And please remember that tomorrow at 10 in this same year, in the same room as well as in the same year, these writers and Junior Price will be inducted into the Hall of Fame. It'll be a great ceremony. So I hope I see you there. Thank you.